It
Okay.
is.
Well, let's talk. Let's begin. The book is Lennon, the Mobster, and the Lawyer: The Untold Story. And this is a fascinating story. I remember experiencing it firsthand because I was a teenager. And I don't know, David, you were an adult, so you might not have been in front of the TV as much as I was. But let's go back. Let me give the audience a background. And Jay, you correct me if I'm mistaken. So
Okay.
the year is 1973. And John Lennon wants to record an album of oldies, songs he grew up playing with the Beatles and the Silver Beatles and all that. And he was just coming off an album called Sometime in New York City, where he was panned for his political posturing. So it seems like an oldies record would be safe harbor. Now, also, let's go back to 1973. It's American Graffiti, spurs a wave of 50s nostalgia. You have the band recording Moondog Matinee, which was 50 songs. One of the biggest hits of 1973, David, if you remember, was Crocodile Rock by Elton John, a 50s,
How could I forget?
50s remake. The movie, the TV series Happy Days is about to come on the air. So there's a heavy air of 50s nostalgia. So in 1973, John commences doing sessions in Los Angeles with Phil Spector, who is not the most grounded individual. He's wild. The sessions are unproductive, and Phil gets into a car accident, right? And he takes the tapes with him. And this is during John Lennon's unstable period, his lost weekend, which we've all heard about. He's with May Pang. He gets thrown out of the Troubadour for heckling the Smothers Brothers. And at the time, he's being sued by Morris Levy, who is I would say, dubious record mogul, right? Known for his ripping off of artists and his thuggery. And the bone of contention is the song Come Together, which was on the Beatles' Abbey Road record. And it's claimed to have plagiarized Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me, which Morris Levy had the publishing to. Now, when we watched the Get Back documentary, which aired recently, we see John presenting Come Together to the other Beatles. And I think either he or Paul outs himself saying, well, this is close to Chuck's You Can't Catch Me. And of course, you can argue, yes, the chord progression, the lyric, and the melody to some degree, but the line that got him in trouble was, here come a flat top is John, and Chuck Berry was Here Comes a Flat Top. So Lennon agrees to include 3 Morris Levy songs in his upcoming rock and roll retrospective record, his remakes. But the tapes are gone. So John records Walls and Bridges. And the last song on the album of Walls and Bridges is Ya Ya by Lee Dorsey, which Morris Levy has the rights to. But it's not really a song. I mean, it's not even complete. It's just John and Julian, mucking about in the studio. And Walls and Bridges comes out first, and Morris Levy sues Lennon, expecting the rock and roll album. Now, John starts the sessions. Go ahead.
Just a minute. He didn't sue him yet.
Oh, okay.
He didn't sue him yet. He started bitching about where are my songs.
All right. Okay. Very good. We'll say bitching instead of sue. So John is working on the rock and roll album in New York with New York session players. And to calm Morris Levy down, who seems to be always pestering John, he gives him the working tapes of what would become the rock and roll album to hear. And of course, these tapes are inferior quality because they were at 7 IPS as opposed to 15 IPS.
7.5, yes.
Right, okay. So Morris Levy goes out and starts advertising this Roots album on television, which I remember seeing as a kid, saying, hey, I want to get this new John Lennon record. It was sold on TV. It had awful cover art of a picture of John from like 68 with long hair. And it also had ads for other artists' LPs on the cover, which was really kind of shoddy, and of course the inferior sound. Now, in the early 70s, it wasn't unusual for artists to advertise their records on television. That was pretty commonplace by then. And Lennon had even considered doing that because he got panned by the critics, and he figured, well, if I sell my record directly to the consumer via television, I'll bypass the critics. And because critics, it seems like in the early 70s, critics had it out for the Beatles anyway. Paul McCartney was getting slagged for Wings. George Harrison, Living in the Material World came out in 1973, and that was not well reviewed. Ringo had a hit album 73, but Ringo wasn't taken seriously as an artist, and that was more of almost like a Beatles project. So Lennon needs to get Roots off the market. He needs to get that off the market, and he needs to get his real rock and roll album on the market, and that's where you come in, Jay, yes?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. The first time I met John, my senior partner, David Dalgenis, who was then representing John in connection with the dissolution of the Beatles partnership. But David was not a litigator. He was a corporate real estate lawyer. So he asked me to go to this meeting on February 3rd, 1975, at the offices of Capitol to discuss this Morris Levy scam that was about to happen. People weren't sure what was going to happen. So I go to the meeting, and during the course of the meeting, the door to the conference room opens and in walks John Lennon. I was completely surprised. I didn't know that he was going to be there, and I didn't know that the Capitol lawyers knew he was going to be here. But the conversation then revolved around, well, what are we going to do about this album? And the Capitol lawyers were talking about how they possibly wanted to, what about getting an injunction against Morris Levy? And I said, well, you know, that's problematic. It's going to be difficult. We have to go to court, spend a lot of money. I asked John, how long will it take to finish the album? And he said, 2 days. And I looked at Capitol's lawyers and said, what about that? So John interrupted and said, I really would like to finish it now. I'm sick of the album. It's been the longest album I've ever worked on. And that was the final decision. And we left the room together down in the elevator. And as we walked out of the Capitol offices down onto the street, he said, well, good night, I'm going home. And I have a pretty strong feeling that that was the first night he went back to the Dakota.
Okay.
And so Levy then started advertising on TV. We in Capitol and EMI started sending out telegrams saying, this is not the authorized John Lennon rock and roll album. Capitol, then finally, John went in on the 4th and 5th of February, finished the album. The parts were shipped to Capitol's factory, and the album came out on February 13th. And Levy immediately pulled his album. I think he'd sold about 1,250 copies. And shortly after that, he brought an action, filed a case in New York Supreme Court, alleging breach of an oral agreement to sell the album on TV on a worldwide basis. Levy, like everybody in the business, knew that the Beatles were signed exclusively to EMI. He had been told that clearly by John and Harold Sider, his business manager. And the next thing that happened was that about 2 weeks later, he filed another action, but this one in federal court, alleging an antitrust violation. Now, he sued John, Capitol, EMI, Apple Records, and Sider in both cases. That had never happened in the 45 years I was a trial lawyer. Nobody brought two actions, one right on top of the other, against the same parties. The fatal mistake, Tom and David, was that cases in New York Supreme Court move very, very slowly. But in the federal court, the day they're filed, they are assigned to one judge for all purposes. The judge will handle it right to the end of the case. And the judges have these fast calendars where they like to keep their calendar moving. And I knew that this case was going to move very quickly. I also knew the judge that was involved.
Right.
He had been on the bench for 16 years. And I told that to John and Yoko. They were very worried about the case. They kept asking me or telling me, look, all we want to do is hold down the amount of money that John is going to owe to Morris. The more I got into the facts, I really believe that that Morris thought he could bully John again. John settled the come together case, and I think by adding capital and EMI, Morris thought, I'm going to be able to get some kind of a deal. He actually.
I just want to stop you for a second. I have a question that you did not specify, and did you know, was there anything in writing with Meyer Lansky? I mean, Morris Levy in the Meyer Lansky of the record business, right? Was there?
There was nothing in writing.
Freud, that was me, yes. The question is, was there anything in writing between Levy and John about?
No.
So how could anything at that point happen? To be perfectly honest, if nothing was written down in regards to "you can't catch me," then it's his word against his word.
Well, there was a settlement on the record of the come together, you can't catch me.
There was.
Hey, that was in writing, but
okay.
There was nothing in writing about the possibility or Morris having a deal.
No, I knew that, but I didn't recall. I don't know if you mentioned in the book that it was in writing that the come together / Chuck Berry thing was officially settled on paper. I did not know that.
Yes, it was in October of '73.
Okay.
In court, just before it was supposed to go to trial.
One of the things, we learn a lot of things from this book, and one of the things I love about this book is you don't have to be a lawyer to enjoy it. You actually explain the case in very conversational tones, and of course, by including the court transcripts, it puts the story front and center. We learn a lot of things about John Lennon in this book, and one of the things is how intelligent he was with regard to this case. He was with you every step of the way.
Well, John made it very clear after we kind of got into the case and the facts. As a trial lawyer, Tom and David, I was all about the facts.
Right.
You had to get the facts down, and I spent a lot of time with John going over the facts, and I kept hearing the same facts over and over again with John and with Maypang and with Harold Sider. So these were the principles. And John made it clear to me in the beginning that he was not going to settle this case. I think he realized that Morris had gotten his hooks into him in the come together case, and he wasn't going to let him do that again. And so we spent a lot of time going over the facts. And John was the best witness I ever had, and that covers a lot of territory. He was very smart. He had a great sense of humor. He rarely forgot anything we discussed. Before his deposition in May of 1975, we spent a couple of days going over the facts again very clearly and what he was going to be asked by Morris's lawyers. And so when it got to the actual trial, I think John was very, very comfortable. I mean, first of all, as both of you know, I mean, here's a man who had been interviewed over and over and over again. And so he was used to being questioned. And the fact that he was under oath and on the witness stand, I don't think made a big difference to him, because we had really established a rapport between the two of us. And even though I was awed in the beginning that this was John Lennon, it got to the point where he was a client. I don't want to lessen the fact that it was John Lennon, but he was a client and he was prepared. And I think he knew that. The night before the trial started, I was staying in the Drake Hotel because I couldn't commute back and forth to New Jersey. It was too long a schlep. And so about midnight, he called me and he said, Yoko would like to come to the trial. Can she come to the trial? And I said, oh, absolutely. I'm sorry. If I'd known she wanted to come, you know, Sean was now about 3 months old.
Right.
I would have invited her. And they went, another sign, and I think this was important in the case, another sign that how strongly he felt and she felt in supporting him was that they came to every day of the trial, 20 days, spread over January. Then we started with the counterclaims in March.
Right.
And they were there every day, even though there were many days where he did not have to testify. And I think the judge, got the message that they were there every day. Morris was not.
Right.
I think Morris knew the case was going badly, and he did not show up nowhere near as often as John and Yoko did.
Well, his lawyer was a pompous ass from all indications.
David, the problem that his lawyer created was his own problem, because from the beginning of the case, he assigned a younger partner to handle all of the pretrial proceedings. Shertman only showed up for the first pretrial conference before Judge McMahon on July 15th, 1975, and he showed up for another one in October. You can't do that if you're a trial lawyer. If you're gonna try the case, you've got to do the work. He didn't take John's deposition, so he had no idea, with a lot of questions that he asked John on cross-examination, what John was going to say. And he didn't defend Morris Levy's deposition. And boy, that comes pretty close to malpractice in my world.
Yeah. Well, Jay, tell our audience about the incredible turn of events with judges, because that's an extraordinary story in itself. This was, kind of my 12th or 13th year of whatever practicing law. Nothing like that ever happened. But we started with Judge McMahon, Morris's testimony, and before a jury. Morris's testimony was going very badly because he kept volunteering. He really didn't answer Shertman's questions. It was almost like Shertman hadn't spent any time preparing him. And the judge kept getting angrier and angrier because we were wasting time. So on the second day, this started on a Monday, and actually it started on my birthday, January 12th. I didn't say anything to John and Yoko, but the next morning, John and Yoko came, picked me up. They'd come up to my office, leave their limo down in the street for a few minutes. And John says to me, Yoko has something to tell you. So I looked at Yoko and she said, I consulted my Swami last night and the trial's going to be interrupted today. And I thought to myself, a Swami. Now I'm dealing with a Swami. So I looked at John and he wouldn't look at me. He's just looking across the room at Yoko. I said, what did he say? He said, the trial is going to be interrupted today. I said, Yoko, this judge, we're in a race here. We've got witnesses coming from California, from London. The judge is not going to permit any delays. He wants this case to move. It's silence, no explanation. So off we go to court. Morris is getting in more and more trouble with the judge. Shertman realizes this. It's pretty obvious. And finally, I start cross-examining Morris. And again, the same problem arises. And all of a sudden, my colleague, Howard Roy, is tugging on my jacket and pointing to Shertman. Shertman is holding up, so that the jury can see it, the nude Two Virgins albums. Right. With the front and rear images of John and Yoko naked. I walked by his table, which was in front of us, grabbed the album, handed it to the judge, and the judge turns around and starts stuffing it into a round waste paper basket. By now, Shertman is standing next to me, and he says, Your Honor, please, that's going to be an exhibit, and one of my exhibits. And the judge says, not in my court.
The judge looks at me and says, "Are you going to move for a mistrial?" I consulted with the other lawyers. We moved for the mistrial, granted. Then he and Schertman get in this bitter argument with Schertman baiting him and accusing him of being biased against their case, with which Judge McMahon, who had a volcanic temper, and everybody in the courthouse who tried a case and knew it, turns to Schertman and says, "You're a liar." Schertman then says, "Well, then you think I'm a liar. You should recuse yourself." The judge does, walks off the bench. We not only don't have a jury, we don't have a judge. I grabbed everybody. I said, "I'm going down to see the chief judge." I went down to see the chief judge, who was in lunch. I dictated a memo. I said, "We need another judge right away." By the time I got back to my office later in the afternoon, after we had lunch, there's a message to come down and see Judge Gruen. And to shorten the story, it turns out, we find out later that night, Judge Gruen says, "I'm assigned to the case. We can start tomorrow. If you guys want to waive a jury, we can then work around my schedule." We find out that night that, and the judge says, "I don't know anything about this case, and I don't know anything about the Beatles or John Lennon." We find out that night that he is a classical musician. He plays the harpsichord and the piano in a amateur classical music group. And he tells us early in the trial, "I listen to a lot of music, but I don't know anything about this kind of music. And so you're going to have to kind of educate me." Well, John and I then decided, we kind of revamped his testimony and turned it into a tutorial about the Beatles and John Lennon, their music, how they gradually took control of the entire process of making a record, from recording their own songs, adding whatever instruments they wanted, and where they took control of the album cover.
Right. The artwork, yes, the artwork especially.
And as you know, and a lot of fans know, the Beatles really turned covers artwork into an art form.
This is absolutely true.
Right.
So you're holding up Walls and Bridges.
Right, which came with the, right.
Yes. Yeah. And I still have those albums that we used with the official sticker on them, the court sticker seeing that they were admitted into evidence. And that was a key to the case.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things.
Great thing about, I'm sorry, Tom. A great thing about the book too is for people who grew up who are younger, who grew up with streaming and CDs, to actually learn about what goes into pressing a record. That was kind of an interesting thing, and the new judge was fascinated with all of this.
He was totally into it, and it drove Schertman crazy. And you can tell from the testimony that I put in the book that, that Schertman was constantly trying to interrupt. These colloquies between John and the judge would go on for minutes and minutes while they were talking about music. The rest of us, might as well not even have been there.
Right.
And the judge just loved it.
Yeah. It definitely shows in the book. A lot of it, I was giggling in parts because you just see the Schertman just getting his ass kicked every which way. There was no way he could recover, particularly with, Meyer Lansky as his client, Well, the picture in the book that Bob Gruen took, where he sneaked his camera into the courtroom, and I didn't know he was there until the end of the day. But that picture illustrates what we're talking about right now. It's the picture of John and the judge facing each other, and John has kind of his finger up, pointing at the judge,
kind of explaining something. And there, right in the middle of the photo, below the judge's bench, is Shirtman standing, and I'm off to the right. And Shirtman is, I'm standing there at the lectern asking John questions. Shirtman is jumping up and down, trying to object. And there were times when the judge just didn't pay any attention to him, as I'm sure you noticed.
It's interesting you talk about Bob Gruen, because when Tom and I interviewed him, one of the, you were talking about how he'd been interviewed so many times, he was completely familiar. Bob, do you remember Tom was talking to us about many people took so many pictures.
Bob Gruen, who does the forward in this book, points out, he says, the Beatles had more photographs than any other band. He says, most bands would have 5 or 10 publicity shots. That includes Elvis, the Rolling Stones. But he noted that the Beatles were photographed almost every day of their career, and that John was very, very comfortable in front of the camera, because we asked Bob, you got these beautiful casual shots of John Lennon, and he was so very comfortable in front of a camera, in front of a group of people. It's not hard to see how he would excel on the witness stand, because he was very, John and all the Beatles were very, very media savvy.
Well, remember from the book, yeah, you're right. But remember from the book that when we got in the limo that night, after Gruen took the picture, I said, I saw Bob Gruen in court today. What was he doing here? And John said, well, I had him come down and take a picture of me testifying. And I said, that's not permitted. It may even be a crime.
Yeah.
And he said, no, he covered the camera with his coat. My next question was, why the picture? He said, someday I'm going to write an album of all of songs about all of my Beatles, my problems and legal problems, and the Beatles' legal problems, and that's going to be the cover. And I thought to myself, boy, this guy really thinks ahead. I mean, here he has this chance, this opportunity to have Gruen come in. And when I told Bob that story decades later, he said, I never knew that. I never heard that story.
Interesting. It's curious when the judge, as you mentioned, he says, I don't know anything about the Beatles. I don't know anything about rock and roll. Now, this is 1973. I mean, certainly he must have heard the Beatles. Certainly he must have seen the impact that the Beatles had on popular culture. I mean, a judge, people in the law business, they're in tune with popular culture and current events. What do you think about the judge saying, I know nothing about rock and roll. I know nothing about the Beatles?
I think that was 100% correct.
Yeah.
He was young. He had only been on the bench between 4 and 5 years. He came out of a big Wall Street white shoe law firm.
Okay.
I believe that completely, because we later learned that the night of the trial, his law clerks went back to one of their apartments, and she and the other law clerk made a couple of Beatles albums for him, and that was the first time he had heard that music. Did he know who John Lennon was and the Beatles? Yeah, he knew the names, but sure. This guy lived in a completely different world from kind of the average person. He was really into classical music. Okay. And he was able
I think you're right. I think so many of the classical aficionados and players knew virtually nothing. I think more than any other genre, classical sticks with classical. I mean, think about Gary Carr, how often he was maligned for all of the things he did outside classical music.
Right, and rock and roll still, I mean, rock and roll was becoming more corporatized, obviously. It was still music for young people. It wasn't legitimized maybe until a couple of years later that people started taking rock music seriously as they would take jazz music. But Jay, another fascinating part of the book, aside from all the legalities, is your friendship with John Lennon. And we really get a glimpse into what life was like with him. Some of the more fascinating stories I enjoy in this is when you take him to Grand Central for the first time, or you take him to a restaurant. Now, you think about it, John Lennon is probably one of the most recognizable celebrities in the world, and he just can't walk the streets and do things that you and I take for granted.
But the other thing about New York, that's right. But the other thing about New York is a lot of the time, I think New Yorkers are used to seeing celebrities. So, I mean, you live in New York, and David, you've lived in New York. So, would people ask him for an autograph? Yes, but in Grand Central Terminal, he had never been there, Grand Central Station. And being an artist, an art student, he was just knocked out by the room, the architecture, everything about it. And I don't know whether the next day you talk about people recognizing him. The next day, that was the first day of his deposition. We went to lunch there. The next day it ended right at the lunch break, and we were walking up Park Avenue, and all of a sudden this woman, middle-aged woman, steps in front of us and blocking our way and says, "You're George Harrison." And John, without missing a beat, said, "Yes, I am. Thank you very much." And she finally let us pass, and we continued on. She didn't ask for an autograph or anything, and we got a few feet beyond where she had stopped us, and we both started laughing hysterically. And that's the day we went to the Bull and the Bear in Waldorf, where he had never been either.
Right.
And the Irish maitre d', I mean, his face lit up when John came in. He reached out and took his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." And John said, "It's a pleasure to meet you."
Right.
From not just this book, but he loved New York City. He loved the fact that he could move around the city, and most of the time people would leave him alone.
Right, for the most part. Other things we learn about John, and I find this fascinating, is when they tried to defame him by holding up the Two Virgins and the Wedding album, those more avant-garde albums. John didn't see those records as failures because he compared it to the works of Allen Ginsberg and Stockhausen and John Cage, and that their works maybe sold 20,000, 30,000 copies. And John saw those works as parallel to them, and he didn't judge them in terms of a pop album. So to him, those records were very successful. I find that fascinating.
Oh, yes. Yeah, because, as he said, when Schertman cross-examined him, and again, Schertman had not taken his deposition, and then the other lawyer that took John's deposition did not get into the Two Virgins album at all. So Schertman violated one of the key laws or the key rules of cross-examination. You don't ask a witness on cross-examination a question unless you know the answer.
Right.
And it became painfully obvious he did not know the answer. John said, "Hey, this was an event. It was a happening." And the whole point of the thing was that under all the hype, all of the glamour and everything, I look just like everybody else. And you raised a very good point, Tom, about when he talked about John Cage and Ginsberg. The judge picked up on that right away because he knew who these people were.
Right.
He knew that they were avant-garde, and he really understood the fact that John was not. He was a rock and roller, but he also had another side of him. And I'm sure you read the last thing that the judge said about John that I quoted in the book, where he was awarding the damages. He said, "Mr. Lennon has a career that is much different than other artists, other rock and roll artists. It's more delicate." And that's one of the reasons, I mean, I'm paraphrasing a paragraph, but that's one of the reasons I'm awarding the damages I'm awarding. In other words, as you pointed out, Tom, he tried these other things, and there was a reason why he did it. He didn't want, and it's the same reason he didn't do the reason he did the rock and roll album. He took a chance with that album. You guys know that.
Right.
Somebody was going to be laying in wait and waiting for it to come out, and would try to really critique him about it.
Well, it's interesting. You bring up the rock and roll album, and for those of you who don't remember what an album looks like, that's the rock and roll album. What's kind of sad about it is, and we learned this from your book, is that John, like the Walls and Bridges album, planned a very elaborate cover or a very elaborate artwork where he would include the lyrics and pictures and other insights into the record. But sadly, because this record was rush released, all we got was the LP in a plain white sleeve. We didn't get any of the fancy artwork. And he also planned a very elaborate commercial, TV commercial for that record.
Yes, and he did. And the only thing he was able to put out was the songbook, which we also we also put into evidence. But that was just, something that he did himself with his own company, and Capitol wasn't really involved in. But you're right, because we had to rush the album out, all of that stuff didn't happen.
Right, exactly.
I was just fascinated that he even knew who Cage and Stockhausen were. Tom and I were talking the other day. I said, it had to have something to do with Yoko, because she ultimately was an avant-garde artist.
Yes.
Oh yeah. I don't know. I don't know whether was her influence that got him involved in all of that. But of course, the Two Virgins album was the first one of that trilogy that they did. The three avant-garde albums that really didn't have any real music on it, and the last one was the wedding album, which John described in his testimony as saying a lot of people keep their wedding album at home. We didn't. We sold it. We sold it to our fans so that it was, like, a souvenir.
Yes. Interesting, fascinating insight on that. One of the things the book also leads us down the path of speculation. Now, we learned from your book, and I've even heard, in my conversations with May Pang, is very parallel to what you're saying, is that John really took care of his recording. He was not the type of artist that would let the producer do all the heavy lifting. He chose the musicians. He knew exactly what parts they were playing. He would review the parts. John Lennon, if a John Lennon album came out, it was the way John Lennon wanted it. And after John Lennon's passing, of course, all these archival demos and scraps have come out, the Beatles deluxe editions, all these John Lennon box sets with alternative takes. And you wonder, if John had lived, would he had allowed these table scraps to come out? It's interesting. Tio Macero, who was Miles Davis' producer, said something to the effect that Miles would be furious that all his outtakes came out. And Lennon and Miles Davis were friends. What do you think? How do you think John would have felt about all these Beatles demos and his demos and things coming out to the public? What say you?
I don't think he would have liked it unless he was really totally involved.
Okay.
As you can see from his testimony about working on the album, I think he even said something like, the album isn't finished until right at the end, and I think, he almost hinted that if he could have had something to do with the actual manufacturing, he would have been involved in that also. So I think you've really touched on a very important point, because he was a perfectionist, and it wasn't finished until it was finished. And even the judge said at one point, well, it's pretty obvious that it wasn't finished. And John, went into detail about being in the cutting room, the master cutting room.
Right, sure.
Which I think is very interesting. And also how I never realized that the order of the tracks on an album is very, very important. Sure. And the space between each song. And that's why he was so meticulous about that. So I don't think he would have liked it. I mean, remember the testimony where he said, well, the Beatles didn't like having a lot of stuff hanging around because rock and rollers tend to die in plane crashes. And then, and then people put other musicians on some of the tracks, which happened to Buddy Holly a lot.
Jimi Hendrix as well, yeah.
Yes, yes. So
And he
I
also discussed,
excuse me?
he also discussed the difference between a 20-minute aside recording versus a 23 or a 28.
Yes.
And the judge, I think, based on the judge being a musician as well, he really got that. He understood how the quality would be compromised the longer it was.
Yes, because the sound, you know, John testified, I like it loud. The sound is very important. Very important. And you know, I think, Tom, you were mentioning that the way he described building the record in the beginning, where he brings the musicians in, he teaches them songs, you know, and then he even talked about, you know, you had to kind of reset the console every day because people would come in and move the chairs, move the stands for the music and everything. And so all of that was really important when he was in charge. I'm sure that's what, you know, a lot of that came out in Get Back.
Right.
With the whole group, how careful they were.
Yeah, yeah. Now, we're talking about John. Let's talk about Jay. Now, some of us, the law business can be tedious. It can be boring to outsiders. And, you know, you're around, you're on the weekends. So, Jay, what's new? What have you been working on? And you tell people you're working with probably one of the famous artists in the world, John Lennon. How did that affect you as a lawyer?
Well, it was kind of a high. I mean, I was on a high for a couple of years, except for the fact in 1976 I tried 2 other cases. While I was working on that one, I was working on 2 other cases. But it was exciting, but and it was interesting, and it was very challenging. But you know, like anything you fellows have done over the years, it was work.
Right.
And I really had to pay attention to it. And the fact that John was so into it was really important. But it was a high for me, and I had a lot of fun doing it. And you know, I kind of tried to develop a clientele in the music business after it was over with people like Eve Moon, and you know, I didn't, you know, again, this was just, it got to the point where it was just another case, but of course it was different, and it was a thrill. And I think one of the reasons, this is the only case that I kept the files, and I dragged around with me through 5 house moves, the 5 or 6 banker's boxes of the entire file of all the transcripts, the appeal record and everything. And, you know, and I never looked at them. I never read them until 5 years ago when I was trying to figure out what am I going to do with them. And I think part of it was, it was my connection with John.
Okay.
You know, I started listening to rock and roll when I was in high school in the early 50s. And those boxes and those files were part of my connection with John. And I was thinking about maybe I'll donate the whole thing to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Oh, okay.
Until I started reading John's testimony. And then I thought, oh no, I've got to tell this story, because the story, there have been little bits and pieces over the years, and nobody's done that right.
Right.
I really wanted John's fans, Beatles fans, musicians like you fellows, to read this story, and particularly his testimony, John's testimony, so you could learn who this person was at this time in his life.
Right, right. And it's fascinating. Now, you yourself, Jay, have been written into Beatle history. You're part of the legend. You're part of the lore.
Well, I never thought of that at the time, and I never thought how difficult it was to get a book published. I just started writing, and I actually did some live shows, which was a lot of fun because I got involved with a friend of mine down here in North Carolina where we live, and she suggested that we put together a 90-minute show. So it's been a great process. The whole interviews and things, meeting people like the two of you,
Right.
having conversations with people about the case. It's been a great experience.
Yeah, there is certainly a huge Beatles cottage industry. I mean, I'm friends with Gary Van Sciok, who talks about John in 1972, sometime in New York City. I'm
Right.
friends with May Pang, obviously, who has an interesting John Lennon story to tell. And it just seems like the legend of the Beatles never goes. It seems like every generation gets more and more fascinated with the Beatles, as solo artists and as a group.
My wife and I were out to lunch yesterday. She had the first step of cataract surgery yesterday morning, yesterday afternoon, and we stopped in this Italian restaurant, and Bella was our waitress, young Bella. And as I was paying the check, I said to her, "Are you a Beatles fan?" And she said, "Well, I like not really." She said, "My parents are." So I have this business card now that has the album cover. I mean, the book cover on the front of it. Sure. And everything. And I said, "Well, you've got to get your mother and father this book because it tells a story that hasn't been told before, and about a time in John Lennon's life that people don't know about it, except for the people who really were very close to him at the time. He and she took the card and she said, "Oh, this is fascinating. This is very interesting. Thank you. People think they know all the stories about John Lennon, but they don't know this one, and that was the principal reason I wrote the book.
Yeah, it is a fascinating fly on the wall portrait of him and of the times. I mean, I remember when the rock and roll album came out. Now, I was born in 1960, so I was not really, I remember the Beatles as a little kid, but the Beatles by 1973, to me, they were kind of old. That was your older brothers and sisters. You had David Bowie, Elton John, Led Zeppelin, and Yes. So I could see where someone like John Lennon, who was very conscious of what was going on around him, was very, very concerned about how he would be perceived by his fans and why he didn't, that Roots album was such a threat to his reputation.
Yes, it was. It was because, as he said and testified, it was just crummy. It was a lousy picture of me. And
the cabbie, right? The cabbie who said, "Hey, I bought that record. I bought your Roots record."
Yes, right.
And John, that was very much an affront to him, that he wanted this case to go his way. One of the other stories that I found, that John had great admiration for you because you had seen Elvis Presley.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, I was a sophomore at Fordham College. I was living in a dorm up in the Bronx. I saw this small ad in probably the New York Herald Tribune. Right. Only Eastern appearance, Elvis Presley. Shows in Philadelphia. I'd never been to Philadelphia. I couldn't get anybody to go with me. And when I told John that I had seen Elvis in 1957, he said, "Oh, what was it like?" I had to tell him step by step how I got to Philadelphia, what the show was like, the fact that the tickets cost me $3.50. I bought two of them and sold one of them at the right outside the venue for $3.50. So I had to tell him the whole story about it. God, it's amazing, because Elvis was probably his first idol.
Absolutely. They idolized the Beatles, and for you to have that experience firsthand, that certainly that made him a fan.
Well, and it was funny. I didn't save the ticket. I didn't,
Sure, it wasn't,
I don't know whether there was any, memorabilia or stuff, T-shirts or whatever. I didn't care about that. I just wanted to see Elvis.
Right. It wasn't.
And he understood that.
Yes. Well, Elvis wasn't a legend then. He was just a contemporary artist. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Now,
I think the whole perspective in the book was, as a bass player, obviously McCartney was my favorite Beatle. And to actually learn what I learned about John, because this is a perspective of John that I don't think anyone's really,
not at all
in any book has the avant-garde, the serious attention to detail and things of that ilk. I don't think anyone really understood that and how important his views. You think about he had the problems with the government becoming a citizen and all, so he had to have some sort of legal passion, just based on the fact that he wanted to get that all the ducks in a row. So this it makes sense that he was so into just being there and learning, because I get the feeling that he just wanted to learn no matter what. That's why the avant-garde stuff was appealing to him. It was something he knew nothing about. I think, to me, that really struck me, this, need, this desire to learn.
Well, I think John, I think John was really a genius, certainly a musical genius, and I think he was interested in the things that were going on around him. He was very shy, and one of the things I learned was that he did not like to say no to people. So he couldn't say no to Morris Levy, who kept pestering him, come up to the farm, come up to the farm, come up to the farm. I want to hear my songs. I want to hear my songs. His first meeting with Morris, he was concerned because this man is angry with me. So, I have to go and explain what happened. And he was also not naive about business, I think. And that's why I think he let Yoko handle a lot of the business side of it. And even Klaus Vormann, when I interviewed him before the case about possibly using some of the band as witnesses, he said, John's very naive about business. He'll talk about, well, I'm thinking of maybe doing an album with Bob Dylan, when Bob Dylan's with one record company and he's with another record company. And so he was all about the music. That was the key. That was the key, I think, to his life.
Right. And you would think, David, obviously he would, from all the Beatles lawsuits and with Alan Klein and his ongoing immigration problem, that he was probably a little bit, more in tune than the average person. But you're absolutely right.
And speaking of that, Tom, remember we were discussing what a jerk John Eastman must have been.
Yeah.
And a jerk on one side as Alan Klein was the jerk on the other side.
Right. And that we learned from this book as well, that John Eastman.
Yeah, really interesting perspectives on that stuff.
Especially given the fact that John and George and Ringo and Paul, they were all they were middle-class guys. So John Eastman probably turned them off. Paul probably aspired to be a little bit more posh and jump a class or two. But John Lennon was a regular guy. So was George and Ringo. And I could see where they were turned off by John Eastman after reading this book, where they liked Klein because Klein was a tough New Yorker, just like they were tough Liverpudlians.
Well, you know the song on Walls and Bridges, Steel and Glass. That's about Klein. That's about Klein.
It is indeed. Now, look, let me ask you this, Jay, before we split. I mean, this aches this book aches for a dramatization. HBO, Netflix, whatever. You've got to turn this book somehow into a film.
Well, I'd love to. And as you note on the back of the endorsement, the one from Michael Lindsay Hogg.
Yes, right on the top. It says HBO. What's taking so long?
Yes, who I met a few years ago through a friend, and we've never met, but we've talked a number of times on the phone. He's been a terrific kind of supporter and mentor. And as you say, yeah, where are you, HBO? It would be a fascinating movie, but I think the book is important because as we've talked about and as you've pointed out, John Lennon was a very important person, and it was a tragedy that his life ended the way it did and when it did. He was too nice a person and too caring and too loving and with a great sense of humor.